Welcome to Women of Concern's brief on the gendered impact of climate change. Today, we're handing the mic to our very own Sally Tilsley, who's an expert on the climate crisis and works to influence decision makers in government to make sure that our response to climate change prioritizes women and girls living in extreme poverty.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Tanya, and thank you for having me. I'm really happy to feature today on Women of Concern.
Well, thank you for being our first guest. So tell us, Sally, what is meant by the gendered impact of climate change? In other words, who are the women most affected by the climate crisis and why are they the most affected?
So by gendered impact of climate change, what we mean is the different ways in which men and women are affected by climate change. So at Concern, we talk about climate change as a poverty multiplier, in that it often exacerbates existing inequalities and the challenges that are already affecting people and societies. And gender inequality is one of these. Because of harmful gender norms, women are more likely to be excluded from decision-making and from labour markets, and are more likely to be dependent for their food and income on the land and natural resources, which are directly affected by climate change. So because of existing inequalities in the system that put them at a disadvantage, women make up the majority of the world's poor. And this makes women and girls more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Obviously, not all women are affected equally, and it's also the people already living in extreme poverty, those who are most affected by the climate crisis, who contributed to it least.
Thank you, Sally. And what you've just said about those who contribute the least to the problem being the most affected by it is a real reminder that we must take the conversation forward and talk about not just climate change, but also climate justice. Who are the people really suffering right now as a result of the climate changing? I'll read a quote by Vanessa Nakate, who is a Ugandan climate change activist. She says, and I quote, "The global south is not on the front page, but it's on the front line." So Sally, can you tell us how Concern is tackling the problem and maybe share some examples from the field?
The reason that Concern, as a humanitarian and development charity, is talking about climate change now is that we are seeing the impacts today on the lives of people we work with in the communities around the world. It's undermining our goal of poverty eradication. Over the last few years, we've seen a rise in global hunger rates, and climate change is one of the key drivers of that. In the Horn of Africa, over the last couple of years, millions of people are experiencing increasingly erratic rainfall resulting in droughts followed by floods. They've also had to endure the worst locust infestations in decades, and these have been exacerbated by unseasonal rains. The people that we work with are often really resilient, so they are used to dealing with things like droughts and have adapted their lives around those cycles. But what we're seeing with climate change now is that droughts, for example, are coming in increasing frequency and increasing intensity. And this makes it harder and harder for people to rebuild their lives in between these events. It just erodes all the precious gains that people have worked really hard for.
Well, yes, it's really difficult to keep rebuilding instead of moving forward.
Of course, and this is layered on top of dealing with COVID and in some places conflict too.
Well, yes, and speaking of conflict, this year alone, and I was shocked to read this, but in 2021, climate disasters have caused more internal displacement than war and conflict. Sally, what is Concern doing to support the most impacted communities, especially women and girls?
So Concern is helping people to build their resilience to climate change. We work with communities to diversify their livelihoods and adjust their farming practices, building on local knowledge. We also work with communities to identify the risks that they face and develop together a plan for how they will deal with them. When we do this, we focus on the people most marginalised and in need of support, so particularly women and girls often. We have to keep in mind the different ways in which climate change affects different people, depending on things like gender inequality. We also work with the whole community, including men and boys, to change the underlying social and gender norms that mean women are more likely to be living in poverty. We work not only with women, but with men as well, to shift their attitudes and behaviours towards masculinity and gender inequality.
We really do champion behavioral change towards women in the communities where we work. And as you mentioned, working to change men's attitudes towards women. Sally, I know that a lot of your work focuses on UN climate processes, and the UN Climate Change Conference, also known as COP26, is coming up in November. So for those listening, how significant is the COP26 conference in pushing the agenda on climate justice? And can you tell us about women's roles in the conference this year?
So the latest scientific report on climate change from the IPCC highlighted the urgency of action required, which makes progress at this year's climate talks, COP26, really important. Back in 2009, high-income countries made a commitment to support low-income countries to tackle climate change, promising to deliver $100 billion a year from 2020. And we just haven't seen these commitments met. So we need to see funding being delivered ahead of and at the COP to ensure that there is the trust in negotiations, but also crucially to make sure that the people worst affected have the resources they need to cope with the climate impacts that they're facing already. We also really need to see countries coming forward with more ambitious plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Women can and do play a critical role in the response to climate change, but women are underrepresented at every level of decision making when it comes to climate change response, especially women of colour, those with disabilities, and those from the global south. Women need to be at the heart of decision making on how we respond to climate change to make sure that the different ways that people are affected are taken into account and inequalities aren't exacerbated by the policies and processes that are put in place.
Sally, what are your hopes and aspirations for the road ahead?
I guess that my hopes are that in addressing the climate crisis, we can also address the underlying inequalities in the system in line with the principle of climate justice, so that we're changing the aspects of the way that the world works that keeps people living in poverty or excluded from decision-making and power.
Well, this is a really high note to end on. If I could physically drop the mic to wrap up with what you've just said, I would do that, but we don't want to break the mic. So lastly, Sally, what makes you a woman of change and therefore a woman of concern?
I think what inspires me to be a woman of change is the people that Concern works with. So they face huge challenges in their lives to just get by, but despite that, they're doing what they can to build a future for themselves and their families. As you mentioned, a lot of my work focuses on UN climate processes where progress can be really slow, and the scale of the change needed can feel overwhelming at times. But getting to meet people who are most affected and speak to them about what they're seeing in their lives really brings home the urgent need for change. And it also helps to feel connected to them and to others trying to make progress on climate change. Knowing that we're all working together makes it feel less insurmountable.
Thank you for listening, everyone. And thanks to Sally for your insights and your passion, and for shedding light on the impact of climate change on women and girls living in poverty. As we've mentioned, the Climate Change Conference, COP26, comes at a really important time when governments, the private sector, and individuals are all more engaged with the urgency of the climate crisis. So to learn more about Women of Concern, you can read our most recent article focusing on the women leading the fight against climate change. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.